To our second seminar of the quarter, and it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Jeff Miller. So Jeff is an assistant professor of biostatistics at Harvard. He got a Bachelor of Science from the Georgia Institute of Technology and a Master of Science from Stanford, both in mechanical engineering. He then joined the United States Air Force, in particular the research lab, for 3 years before heading to Brown University, where he earned a PhD in applied mathematics. After his PhD, he did a postdoc at Duke and then joined the faculty at Harvard. Among other things, Jeff is interested in Bayesian statistical modeling, and his talk today is titled Robust Inference and Model Selection Using Bagged Posteriors. So thank you, Jeff, for joining us today, and please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation. This talk is kind of a long time in coming. I was going to speak a couple of years ago, and then all the COVID, isolation stuff hit, and talk had to be canceled. So finally got a chance to reschedule it, and it's really a pleasure to speak to all of you today. So thanks for coming. I am going to tell you about some work that I did. It's a joint project with my former postdoc, Jonathan Huggins, who is now tenure track faculty at Boston University. And this is work on trying to develop robustness to model misspecification in a way that's computationally easy to do. And we found that using basically just the simple technique of bagging on the posterior has some really nice properties. So that's the gist of what I'm going to tell you about today. I posted in the chat a link to the slides if you'd like to open them up and follow along. And there's also a couple of preprints on this work, which are on the archive, which you can check out as well. So I'll give you some of our motivation for this work, some background. I'll describe the methodology that we propose, the theory that we developed for this method, and look at a couple of applications to illustrate it all. So first, the motivation. So it's known that standard Bayesian inference is sensitive to model misspecification. And so what do I mean by model misspecification? Basically, if you assume a particular model or a family of distributions for what the data comes from, that model is said to be misspecified if the true data generating distribution is not in that family or is not one of those models. So unfortunately, this often leads to unreliable uncertainty quantification and poor predictive performance when using a misspecified model. There's been several methods that have been proposed for being robust to model misspecification when doing Bayesian inference or inference more generally, not necessarily in a Bayesian setting. But finding generally applicable and computationally feasible methods still remains somewhat of a challenge. And so we're going to propose a technique for obtaining certain kinds of robustness in a computationally easy way that's very generally applicable. So as a toy example to illustrate the problem that we're going to address, let's consider a very, very simple situation where the data is simply IID draws from a Bernoulli P model, right? Couldn't get any simpler. So just a sequence of coin flips. And now let's consider the, yes, very contrived situation where we are only considering two possible models. One is that the P in this Bernoulli is 0.2, and the other is that the P is 0.8. But let's suppose that the data is being generated from a Bernoulli P with P equal to 0.501. So the model 2 is closer or perhaps better in some sense, but both of the models are wrong. Now, if you look at the log likelihood ratio of these two models as the number of data points n increases, it does a random walk up and down, sometimes favoring one model and sometimes favoring the other. And that's not too surprising. But what's interesting is if you look at the posterior probability of model 1, say, as the sample size increases, it does this very dramatic oscillation between the two extremes of 0 posterior probability, or very close to 0, and very close to 1. So for example, let's say that you had 250 observations. Then this posterior distribution is telling you with very high confidence or very high certainty that model 1 is the better model, or is, maybe not correct, but it's better in some sense. If you got some more data, though, that would flip to saying model 2 is better, and back and forth and back and forth. And eventually, in this case, it settles down on saying model 2 is better. But what's disturbing is that for finite sample sizes, the uncertainty quantification here is potentially very misleading. Now, this is not just a contrived issue. It actually happens very frequently, for example, in phylogenetic tree inference. And this is something which has been observed in the literature in a few papers going way back to the early 2000s. And this is really important because Bayesian phylogenetic inference methods are very widely used. And unfortunately, these methods can lead to self-contradictory results due to this model misspecification, which is present. To illustrate that, we're showing results here from a whale genetics data set. And what you're seeing is for several different evolutionary models, let's say you assume this JC model, which is called the Jukes-Cantor model, which is one of the simpler models. And you split the genetic data into two parts, which we call S1 and S2. If you compute a posterior distribution using only the S1 data, and then you compute a posterior distribution using only the S2 data, and you compare the overlap of those two posteriors in terms of the posterior mass in the overlap, then you get something which is this brown dot, S1 versus S2, which is basically 0, right? So what does this mean? What this is telling you is that the posterior is not appropriately quantifying your uncertainty because on two different data sets, which are both being drawn from this distribution, but just on different parts of the genome, you're getting 0 overlap in the posteriors. If you compare S1 versus all the data, that's the red dots, and S2 versus all is the purple dots. So basically, this lack of overlap, or like 100% overlap in some cases, is showing that this toy example is not just a contrived situation. It happens in reality. Okay, so now another example is in variable selection. This is some simulated data with an increasing sample size, drawing data from a misspecified distribution in which the covariates have been sort of non-linearly transformed before using the model. And when you look at the posterior probability that each coefficient is non-zero or is included in the model, then what happens, if you look at the blue dots, that's showing you the standard posterior probabilities. And for example, 5 is the only variable which is actually present in the model, in the true data generating process. The dots show over repeated simulations. So if you generate a bunch of different data sets and you look at that posterior probability, then that's what this cluster of blue dots is. And what's disturbing is that as the sample size increases, you get this, again, kind of dramatic going to the extremes of the posterior probabilities. And in some cases here, it's very high for some, and then it goes to 0 as you get more data. Or maybe it just remains at the extremes, sometimes favoring one or favoring that component and sometimes not. All right, so that's the kind of motivation, the problem that we're going to try to solve. So now I'll talk a little bit about background on approaches for misspecification and thinking about misspecification. So or maybe I'll pause for a second and see if anyone has any questions so far on kind of those motivating examples. Okay, and feel free, to jump in at any time if you have questions. I don't know what the usual format is here, but feel free to just chime in and stop me if you have a question at any time. So to introduce a little bit of notation, let's denote the true data generating distribution of the observed data by P naught. And we're going to suppose that there's this assumed model, which is parameterized by theta. And in the misspecified setting, we're supposing that P naught is not one of the elements of this model. And the pseudo-true parameter, theta star, is defined to be the nearest point in the model to P naught in terms of KL divergence, or Kullback-Leibler divergence. In this talk, we're going to take the pretty usual standard perspective that in this misspecified setting, this parameter theta star is the quantity of interest. And it's known that the posterior does concentrate at theta star asymptotically under mild regularity conditions, but it has been observed, for example, by Klein and van der Vaart, that it's not correctly calibrated in the sense that these the Bayesian credible sets that you would construct from a misspecified posterior do not have correct frequentist coverage. It's also been shown by Peter Grunwald and a collaborator that slow concentration can occur at the theta star, which can lead to very suboptimal, very poor predictive performance. All right. So there's been quite a few methods proposed for improving robustness to misspecification. In the context of you're trying to do prediction or fitting the data distribution, really the interest is in this pseudo-true parameter, which is kind of the setting we're focusing on. And there's been quite a few methods proposed. I list some of them here. Another slightly different perspective, which I've taken in previous work, is to focus on what we call an ideal parameter, which is not necessarily this pseudo-true parameter, but could be some other point in the model, which was the true parameter before some perturbation caused the actual, the observed data distribution to be something different. And we proposed a method called the Corson posterior for dealing with that situation. But that's not really the focus of the talk today. So the method that we're going to propose to deal with this issue is just bagging the posterior, basically. It's very, very simple. So I'll explain what I mean by that. So this method, which we call Bayes bag, the term was actually coined by Peter Buhlmann in a paper, a short discussion of a discussion paper a few years back, and we borrowed that term here. So the basic idea is simply to use bagging on the posterior, that is, to average the posterior over many bootstrap data sets. So more precisely, let's say that the original data set, which I'll denote by X, has n data points, x1 to xn. And let's denote by X star a bootstrap copy of that original data set, which has data points x1 star up to xm star, where m is not necessarily equal to n. And these are obtained by sampling with replacement from the original data points. Now, the posterior that you get by treating X star as if it were the original data set, I'll denote by this, pi of theta given X star, which is just proportional to the prior times the likelihood when you treat this as your data. The bag posterior, we will define as averaging over all of the posteriors that you can get like this. In other words, if you consider all the possible ways to sample n times with replacement from this, sample m times with replacement from the original data set, there's n to the m of those possible ways. And if you average over all of those, that's what we define to be the kind of theoretical bag posterior. Let me see if anyone has any questions so far. Feel free to jump in. Okay, so now in practice, of course, you could never compute all n to the m of those, at least when n is reasonably large. So what we do is approximate that theoretical bagged posterior by just generating B bootstrap data sets, which is the kind of the standard thing to do when you bootstrap. You generate bootstrap data sets, say B times, and then you do a simple Monte Carlo approximation here to that, that previous sum. And this is computationally very straightforward. So you can use any existing posterior computation technique for computing the standard posterior to compute each of the terms in this sum here, right? Because this is just, so X star subscript B is just a data, so you're just treating it as a data set and running a standard, computing the posterior as if that were the original data. So that's easy to do. You do that for each of the B data sets, and you just average over all of them. For example, if you want to compute a posterior expectation, then you just average the expectations of each of those. Now, the first question that comes up is, how do you choose B, right? How do you choose the number of bootstrap data sets? We found as a default, whoops, I clicked something, B around 50 to 100 often suffices. Formally, if you want to quantify the error in this simple Monte Carlo approximation, it's very easy to do because the bootstrap data sets are IID given the original data set. So you can just use this standard formula for the variance of a simple Monte Carlo approximation to see, have you chosen B to be sufficiently large for whatever you're computing. Now, a more tricky and subtle issue is how to choose M, the bootstrap dataset size. In other words, how, when you generate back here this bootstrap copy, you have to sample M times with replacement, where I said M is not necessarily equal to N. And so what should you choose M to be? Now, it turns out that this is not a trivial thing. The choice of M is intimately connected with the calibration of uncertainty in this bagged posterior that you get. And in particular, as the ratio of M over N increases, the bagged posterior becomes more concentrated. And so through the theory and the empirical experiments that we've done, we suggest choosing M to be little o of N in the model selection setting, or potentially, depending on what you're interested in doing with the method, choosing M to be proportional to N for some constant C less, between 0 and 1. As a default, we found that choosing M to be equal to N to the 0.95 works well in theory and in practice. All right. So that's model selection. What about parameter inference? What if you want to quantify uncertainty about a continuous parameter? So as a default, in this case, it turns out things are a little bit different, and we suggest using M equals to N as a conservative choice that's robust to the specification. And we have some theory which is actually going to be appearing in a revision of the paper, which shows that you get some nice self-coherent uncertainty quantification properties when you do this. Now, it turns out in this case, for this parameter inference setting, choosing M equal to 2N actually coincides asymptotically with the standard posterior. So it's a little bit surprising. You might think, oh, well, M equals N would be kind of the standard thing, but actually to give you the standard posterior, and choosing the bootstrap data set size to be twice as large as the original one asymptotically recovers the standard posterior. Okay, so that's how we suggest choosing M. And as I mentioned before, there has been some previous work on this Bayes bag method. And in fact, it was suggested originally, as far as we know, by the authors of a couple of papers in 2002 and 2003, looking at phylogenetic inference. And in that case, in that situation, they were kind of undertaking some empirical studies of posterior inference using Bayesian methods, and they tried this. And they were in particular trying to compare bootstrap versus Bayes. The method was independently proposed by Peter Buhlmann in 2014, and he looked at a simple univariate Gaussian location model and coined the name Bayes bag. Surprisingly, there's been there's really little empirical or theoretical investigation of bagging the posterior, despite the really widespread use of bagging in the machine learning community and statistical learning community, and the widespread use of Bayesian methods. So it's kind of surprising. Now, I should point out that despite the similar sounding names, bagging the posterior or the bag posterior is very, very different than Bayesian bagging or Bayesian bootstrap, which are basically ways of, so like if you're doing Bayesian bagging, what you're trying to do is like you have a classifier, for example, and instead of just doing standard bagging, it's to do that in a kind of Bayesian way by introducing some kind of continuous weights over the power, like the powers of the point space of the likelihood, rather than discrete weights in some sense. Okay, so that's a little bit of background on previous work. And to kind of give you a way of thinking about this rather than just out of the blue, let's just bag the posterior. There's a really interesting interpretation of what's going on here via the idea of Jeffrey conditionalization. So to explain what Jeffrey conditionalization is, I'm just going to think very abstractly about, let's say we have a distribution over variables x and y. And now instead of getting data, which is the usual situation, let's suppose we are informed, we're just told that the true distribution of x is p naught, right? And what Jeffrey says to do in that situation is to quantify your uncertainty in y by using the marginal distribution over y that you get by basically replacing the marginal on x by p naught, right? So here, so this p of y given x times p naught of x, this is the joint distribution that you would get by sort of like taking out the marginal that you assumed under the model for, you know, p of x, and just plugging in p naught of x instead. Marginalize out x, and that gives you your new marginal on y. So now let's connect this with the bagged posterior. To do that, let's take x in this situation to be the data, x1 to n, and y to be a parameter, theta. And let's say first, what if we were told that the true distribution of the data was p naught? So what does this tell us to do? Well, it says to quantify your uncertainty in theta by using this thing here, which is just plugging in p naught, the distribution over all n data points here, and times p of theta given the data, which is just the posterior, right? This is the standard posterior given that data. But instead of just using the posterior for a single data set, you're integrating over all possible data sets here, over where this the weight of each of them is the true distribution. Now, we don't know the true distribution in reality. So as an approximation to it, you might say, well, what if we plug in the empirical distribution, right? Let's suppose the data is IID, right? And let's plug in the empirical distribution for P naught of XI. If you do that, and then you compute what this resulting integral is, then you actually get that this is approximately equal to 1 over n to the n times the sum over all possible bootstrap data sets of the posterior of theta given x star 1 to n, which is exactly the bagged posterior, the theoretical bagged posterior with m equals to n. So it's a kind of remarkable coincidence here that pops out, and it gives you a way of thinking about the bagged posterior in a kind of principled manner. Okay, so maybe I'll pause before going into our theory and see if anyone has any questions. All right. So that's Jeffrey conditionalization interpretation. And I'm just going to briefly go through the theory, and only in the case of model selection, rather than model selection and parameter inference. We have the two papers, the preprints we have are, one focuses on model selection, and the other focuses on this parameter inference setting. In both situations, we're going to simplify to the setting of IID data. Now, it's a very important extension to consider dependent data like spatial data or time series, but so far we're only considering IID data. Now, to just provide an overview of our theoretical results, for the model selection setting, we show that if there are two models that provide a nearly equally good fit to the data distribution, then the standard posterior over those two models oscillates randomly, kind of like that Bernoulli toy example, strongly favoring one or the other at random. Meanwhile, the bag posterior stabilizes the posterior probability, sorry, that should say posterior probabilities of the two models, which improves the reproducibility, right? Because if you have, if you were to run the experiment again and get a completely different result, then in some sense, that's lack of reproducibility. For the parameter inference setting, we derive the mean and covariance of the bag posterior, and we prove a Bernstein-von Mises result characterizing the asymptotic normal distribution of the bag posterior. So to go a little bit more into the detail of the model selection results, first, it should be said asymptotically, if there's one model that's closer than all the others, then we know that the posterior is going to concentrate on that model, right? So that situation is kind of so trivial that it's not worth really thinking about. So what we do instead to study the non-asymptotic regime where you have, like, say, a finite amount of data and it hasn't concentrated yet all on that one model, but still using the tools from asymptotics, what we do is we consider sequences of models. So we're going to focus, at least I'm focusing in the talk, on just the case of two models, but the paper considers more generally like a finite amount of models. But let's suppose we have now, instead of just two fixed models, two sequences of models, which are both remaining sort of relatively competitive in terms of how well they can describe the true data distribution, but they're both misspecified. So with that setup, what we're going to do is define the log likelihood ratio of the two models to be lambda n, and assume that these two models are asymptotically comparable in the sense that the expectation of, if you take that log likelihood ratio and divide by square root of n, right? So that kind of gives you like a central limit theorem kind of scaling. We're going to assume that the expectation under the true data distribution of that quantity converges to a finite limit. Meanwhile, we're going to assume that the variance of the same thing is equal to a constant for all n. Now, we do generalize that in the paper, but for simplicity, just suppose it's a constant. Meanwhile, we're also going to assume that the ratio of the bootstrap data set size to the observed data set size n converges to a constant c, which is finite. Right. And also, we have to assume that the bootstrap data set size m goes to infinity for our theory to work. Now, the ratio of this limit here, which we call mu infinity, over sigma infinity, can be interpreted as kind of the effect size in favor of model 1. So I'm going to use that terminology later. So our results show that asymptotically, under these assumptions, the standard posterior, under the standard posterior, the probability of model 1 concentrates at the extremes of 0 or 1. In other words, it converges to a Bernoulli random variable, right? So it's saying, putting all its mass on saying like it's either 0 or it's 1. Mathematically, we can say it this way: the posterior probability of model 1 is converging in distribution to a Bernoulli, and the parameter of that Bernoulli is phi here is the standard normal CDF. So it's taking that effect size and mapping it through a standard normal, and that gives you the probability that it's going to either like very, very strongly favor model 1 or very, very strongly favor model 2. Meanwhile, the bag posterior probability of model 1 converges to a random variable with a continuous distribution on the interval from 0 to 1. And we precisely characterize what that limiting distribution is. Specifically, it's equal to this. So again, phi is the standard normal CDF. C is that asymptotic ratio of m over n. And z is a normal random variable. with mean equal to this effect size in favor of model 1 and variance 1. I'm going to show you some plots to see what that random variable looks like. In particular, if m in mu infinity is 0, meaning the two models are asymptotically or even like exactly equally good, and this C, the asymptotic ratio of m over n is positive, then what you get according to these results is that the standard posterior converges to a Bernoulli 1/2, so it's really an equal coin flip, and the bag posterior converges to a uniform on the interval from 0 to 1. Meanwhile, if C equals 0, so like if m is little o of n, as we suggest for some of the in our recommended settings, the bag posterior converges to 1/2. So not Bernoulli 1/2, it's just a half, right? It's saying I equally give equal probability to model 1 and model 2. Okay. So to illustrate this theory with some plots, here I'm showing you that as this effect size mu over sigma, which I'm calling delta here, increases, or even for relatively large values of that effect size, the probability that the standard posterior is favoring the model which is worse is relatively high. So like close to 0.2 here. So 1 in 5 times, even if this effect size is like 1, which means it should be favoring, model 1, pretty strongly. 1 in 5 times, it's overwhelmingly favoring model 2, which is kind of disturbing. Meanwhile, the probability that the bag posterior is, relatively strongly favoring the wrong model, meaning that this U star, which is the bag posterior probability of model 1, asymptotically, the probability that this is small, meaning that it's doing the wrong thing, is considerably smaller. So that's good. It's doing much, much better. This is just showing what the distribution of that asymptotic random variable for the bag posterior probability of model 1 is. That was this thing here. And so, like I said, when the two models are really like exactly equally good in terms of how well specified they are, you get a uniform. If this effect size in favor of model 1, as it gets bigger, then this distribution starts to favor the model which is closer. So, but it never fully concentrates on that model until that effect size goes to infinity. I'm going to skip that slide and jump ahead. So make sure I have some time to go through these applications, but I'll pause again here and see if anyone has any questions.
Jeff, this is interesting. Do you have any intuition that you could provide on why sort of the ratio, the choice of M is different for these different regimes?
The choice of M, I'm sorry?
Yes, M.
Like for model selection versus parameter inference, you mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Yeah, so this is a great question. And I have to say, I don't have like a really great intuition for why. We worked out the theory, and what we found is that it's just different in model selection versus parameter inference. So, fundamentally, if you think about kind of how quickly things are concentrating in the model selection setting, if there's one model which is closer, then it's the posterior is asymptotically, it's exponentially so like concentrating at that model. Whereas in a parameter inference setting, under kind of regularity conditions, you typically get like a square root n kind of convergence. So the speed at which things are concentrating maybe sort of has something to do with it. Also, yeah, it's a fundamentally like a discrete sort of thing here in the model selection setting versus continuous, obviously, in the parameter inference setting. So yeah, I don't have a real great explanation for why, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you. That's okay. I mean, I have to think more about it.
Yeah, me too. Any other questions? Okay, great. So I'll give you a couple, few applications that we've tried this out on. First, I'm going to talk about variable selection and phylogenetic tree inference, which are focusing on model selection. And I'll give one example in kind of a predictive or parameter inference setting, focusing on prediction. So for the first application, we're going to consider a very standard Bayesian variable selection model for linear regression. And what we're going to do is, under the prior, assume that each variable is included with probability Q0 independently, and on the prior for the prior on the coefficients and the variance of the linear regression model, we're just going to use normal and inverse gamma priors, which if you construct the using a conjugate prior construction, you can just integrate them out analytically. So that just makes life easy to do the experiments. Now, first, we're going to simulate data from the assumed model. So that's a well-specified setting. And then to generate data from a misspecified setting, we're going to nonlinearly transform the covariates and then just simulate from like a linear regression model still, but with those nonlinearly transformed covariates. So now the model is misspecified in that second scenario. In both scenarios, the true coefficient vector is sparse, so it only is going to depend on a subset of the actual covariates. But in setting 2, it's misspecified. Now, to explore the effect of the bootstrap data set size M, we're going to set it equal to n to the alpha for a range of alpha values, and then we'll look at what happens. So first, let's see what happens when the model is correct. So what you're looking at here is there's 10 covariates which could be included, or components which could be included. And so that's 1 through 10 here. And on the y-axis is the posterior probability that each of them is included. Now, there are multiple dots here because we're doing this for over many repeated simulations. So each dot is from a different simulation. And the different colors are showing for different values of this alpha, the power to which we take n when doing the bagged posterior. So what you see here is general trend is, so I should say, first of all, the plus indicates that component 5 or variable 5 is the only one which is actually being used to generate the data. It's the only one which is should be included in principle. And first, general patterns, as the amount of data increases, the standard posterior is concentrating at the correct thing, and the bag posterior, depending on the choice of alpha, is tending to favor the correct thing also. So it's doing something pretty similar to the standard posterior in this correctly specified setting, except that you'll notice that across repeated simulations, as the alpha parameter decreases, this is the bag posterior is tending to be more and more giving you sort of more similar results over repeated simulations. So it's sort of more consistent across simulations in some sense. Now there's a slight price to pay here when alpha is 0.55 is pretty small, then it's not really concentrating as quickly on the correct component here. But nonetheless doing pretty similar to the standard posterior. Now let's look at the more interesting setting when the model is incorrect. And so here, going back to this sort of is recapitulating what I showed you at the beginning for the standard posterior, which is in blue. What you find is that it's kind of some of the time in some simulations you get posterior probabilities close to 1 or close to 0 for many of these components. As the sample size increases, that remains the case for certain components, and sometimes just goes to 0 in other cases, or 1, I guess, in other cases. Meanwhile, the bag posterior is giving you much more reproducibility across repeated simulations. right? And so what you see here is even for these variables which are going to the extremes of 0 and 1 under the standard posterior, the bag posterior when m equals n is giving you something almost like a uniform distribution here, which makes sense because there's different models which are exactly equally good in this simulation. So you can either include like component 2 or 3, or you can include component 7 or 8, and that gives you equally good models in terms of KL divergence. Now, what's interesting here is that even though 5 is going to 0 in the standard posterior, the bag posterior is giving you decent posterior probability on that, which is somehow, capturing the fact that 5 is the only component which should truly be included. So that's kind of interesting. Now, on real data sets, it's a lot messier, but the general trend is that what we see is the bag posterior tends to give you greater reproducibility across different subsets of the data. So we can't, get two, data sets, magically create two data sets from one, but we can take our one data set and split it up. And that's what we did. So when you compare the results from different splits of the data, then it tends to be more reproducible. So I'm showing here again, the different colors are for different values of alpha. Blue is again the standard posterior. And you see, like, for example, here in this Boston housing data set, component 6, you see that as alpha decreases in particular, you get kind of more reproducibility across data sets. Okay. And yeah, this is another real data set in the variable selection setting. And same kind of basic story. Some things to point out here, for example, component 8 is being included with very high probability for Bayes and all the Bayes bag posteriors. The stars here, I didn't explain. I think I said it. No, I didn't explain it, unfortunately. The star is showing what you would get if you ran the posterior on the full data set. And each of the circles is showing on 3 different splits of the data set, or 3 different subsets of the data. So here, you would like the dots to kind of be closer to one another, the circles, and closer to the star, which is indicating greater reproducibility. So like, for example, here, the Bayes bag posteriors are giving you, kind of a little bit better reproducibility while still recovering this, like this one component that has very high probability of being included. Okay. Another application that we ran this on is phylogenetic tree inference, which is one of the motivating examples. And to do this, we just used a standard Bayesian package called Mr. Bayes. And we used this whale data set from a paper by Yang in 2008, which has mitochondrial DNA from 13 different whale species. So to do this, we actually considered 5 different commonly used models for the evolutionary process, which are abbreviated here. And for each of them, we compute a posterior over trees. So you get this posterior over this combinatorial space. And that's the thing that you're really interested in, is the tree. For the bag posterior, for computational reasons, we only used a couple values of m, either m equals n or n to the 0.95. And we used 100, b equals 100 for the number of bootstrap, for the number of bootstrap data sets to use to compute the bag posterior. Now, to assess the reproducibility in a kind of more quantifiable way, we computed the overlap of 99% highest posterior density regions for 2 pairs of posteriors. So like, if you take one data set, you compute a posterior, and then you take another data set and compute the posterior, then what we did is looked at a 99% credible set for each of them and calculated how much probability mass is in the overlap. And so what we find in the left plot here is showing you, this is exactly what I showed you at the beginning. This is what the standard posterior does. What you see is that quite often, especially for like the simpler Jukes-Cantor model, which is in pink, there's like 0 overlap. between this model and these other plausible evolutionary models. So this is comparing the overlap between using different evolutionary models to compute the posterior. If they're all sort of like plausible or reasonable, then you would hope that they wouldn't give you wildly different posteriors. And yet that's what we're seeing here in many cases under the standard posterior. Whereas the Bayes bag posterior gives you pretty, reasonable, like, not kind of extreme values of this overlap. So it's saying, you're getting some decent overlap in the probability in the posteriors when you use the Bayes bag approach. Okay, so that's encouraging. So that was comparing across different evolutionary models. And sorry, I misspoke earlier. This is the plot I showed you at the beginning, which is if you take the data set and you split the genome into different parts, like set 1, S1, and set 2, S2, versus using all the data to compute a posterior. These are the overlaps you get when using the standard Bayesian approach. And these are the overlaps you get when using Bayes bag with m equals n or n to the 0.95. Same story again, you get kind of more extreme, especially for certain models like the JC model, or MT-MAM is using a mitochondrial model. So this is also very encouraging. As a third and final example of an application, we're going to look at this hierarchical mixed effects logistic regression model, which has been used in some previous work by Brown and Draper, looking at prenatal care data from Guatemalan communities. So we just took this existing model, which had been used, and the same data which they used. And what we wanted to do was look at the predictive performance of the standard posterior versus the bag posterior, versus a few other methods which are also kind of based on the bootstrap, right? To kind of get a sense of, right, well, is this doing something fundamentally different than just bootstrapping? Or what if you just bootstrap and did, compute the MLE, which you basically get something basically the same as the bag posterior in terms of prediction. And what we find is that actually it is very different. And the performance, by accounting for both Bayesian uncertainty and sort of the sampling based uncertainty that you get from the bootstrap is important. And it does give you significantly better predictive performance, especially, so this is a pretty complicated model with a lot of parameters. And so accounting for that uncertainty in those parameters is important, we find empirically. So this is showing the mean log predictive density of held out data when using a misspecified model. Sorry, I should say the model was, so what I'm going to show you here is on simulated data using this model that was used previously. I'm not showing you the real data. So when you simulate from a well-specified model and you look at this, the predictive performance on held out data, then the Bayes approach, not surprisingly, does the best. Bayes bag is second, and the others are doing roughly equally good, but considerably worse. Whereas in the misspecified setting, it turns out if you simulate from a misspecified version of this model, then Bayes bag actually just barely edges out, at least in these experiments, the standard posterior, and is still doing considerably better than these other approaches. So all in all, the conclusion here, I think, is bagging the posterior is really easy to use. It's pretty widely applicable. And it gives you some really significant improvements on standard Bayesian inference in terms of stability, accuracy, and reproducibility. The main, I guess, kind of disadvantage, a couple things to point out. One is, yes, you have to compute the posterior 50 or 100 times, but if you have access to a cluster, that's not so bad. You can spin it out to 50 different processes, and it might take you the same amount of time in practice, or not a significantly longer amount of time. Another main limitation is that this is really for situations where you can do like a standard bootstrap, like if the data is IID. And so an important extension would be to non-IID settings like time series or spatial data. Another area for future work, and I have a postdoc right now, Neil Spencer, who's doing some really cool stuff on using Taylor approximations to speed up the computation of the bag posterior for model selection. Developing a finite sample theory for bag posteriors rather than relying on the asymptotics as we do would be interesting. And also improving the model assessment or model criticism techniques that you could do based on this approach would be interesting. So that's my talk. Thanks to all of you for watching, and I'll be really happy to take any questions that you have.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, for the great talk. So time for questions.
Thank you, Jeff, for the wonderful talk. I'm not a Bayesian, but listening to your talks makes me want to use your method sometime. And yeah, I have a question about choosing the alpha, like choosing the M used for bootstrap. And you mentioned that for model selection, the alpha should be smaller than 1 for like more conservative inference. And so I saw your example that when with smaller alpha, it's like more concentrated, basically more reproducibility. So is that your general recommendation? Like if you want more reproducibility, you want to choose a smaller alpha?
Yeah, so there is a trade-off. I can go back here. So this one, I think in particular, illustrates it. Sorry, I'm trying to. Yeah, so the smaller the alpha is, the more kind of reproducible or more consistent it will be. But you may pay, some price in terms of like here where the model is correctly specified. When the alpha is, considerably smaller, like 0.55, you're not getting as rapid of a concentration at like the correct model in the situation where there is a correct model. So there is a kind of trade-off there. But that's why we kind of suggested something in the range of like alpha equals 0.95.
I see. And another question is, can we use the method to select the prior?
Interesting. Yeah. So we something I didn't talk about here is that we have proposed a way of doing model criticism based on the bag posterior, basically by comparing the variance or sort of how spread out the bag posterior is versus the standard posterior, and what that relationship would be if the model was correct, right? And so we define what we call we define a certain index of model misspecification, which can also be used not only to tell if like the likelihood is wrong, but it can also interestingly tell you if your prior is really bad, right? Mm-hmm. So if your prior is really bad, even though like technically the model might, like the true distribution might be in your assumed model space, if your prior is really bad, it's almost like it's not in your model, right? Because you're giving it so small probability under the prior. And that actually shows up when you look at this we call the model mismatch index. So, we didn't sort of prescribe a way of choosing a prior based on that technique, but it can give you some insight into situations when your prior might be really bad.
Yeah, interesting. And one last question from me is that I'm interested in the Bernstein von Mises theorem. So you just briefly mentioned this. Yep. So can you tell me a little more about like what this theorem says? Is it showing that your bagging is asymptotically equivalent to bootstrap MLE asymptotically, or?
Yeah, So let me show you the theory here. I have it in a couple slides at the end. So well, let me see if I need this. I don't think so. All right, so here's the, can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is in the parameter inference setting. So here we're thinking about a posterior on a parameter theta. And I used theta star before, but here I'm going to use theta naught to denote the point which is the minimal scale divergence from the true distribution. And what we showed is that under the standard posterior, well, we didn't show this, but it's known under the standard posterior that if you look at the posterior, so theta is the thing which is sort of the random quantity in this. You're looking at the posterior on theta, which has been centered at the MLE theta hat n and scaled up by root n so that it has a limiting distribution, which is non-trivial. And that thing converges in distribution to a normal with covariance matrix equal to the inverse of basically like a Fisher information thing here. Now, on the other hand, we also know that, so this is again something which is known from standard theory, the MLE is asymptotically normal, right? So now the random thing is theta hat. If you think about the randomness coming from the data, it's known that that this thing is asymptotically normal with this normal distribution, right? And this is the sandwich covariance matrix here. It's well known. So if the standard posterior was, so the standard posterior would be correctly calibrated if this covariance matrix was equal to this covariance matrix. But that is not always the case when the model is incorrect. So what we showed is that in general, for the bag posterior, the asymptotic covariance is basically like the sum of these two. So if I go back here, this is J theta naught inverse, and this is the sandwich covariance. It's the sum of these two for the bag posterior divided by C, where C was this limiting ratio of M over N. So basically what you get when you do the bag posterior is you get a sum of Bayesian uncertainty plus frequentist sampling uncertainty scaled by this C factor here. That's what you get when you do the bag posterior. So that's basically our Bernstein. That's the sort of heart of the Bernstein-von Mises theorem we show.
Yeah, thank you.
Great question. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Well, maybe one quick question. So does the choice of the prior interact with your recommendation for those hyperparameters of the bagging in any way?
Sorry, could you say it again?
Does the choice of the prior interact with the recommendations you gave for those parameters? So could I make up for some of those, the choice of alpha, I don't remember the other parameters, by choosing different priors?
Yeah. So yes, it could affect that choice. In one of the papers, we talk about choosing M, or equivalently choosing alpha. And we describe a method for choosing it based on basically like this this model mismatch index. So because the mismatch index in some way sort of accounts for the effect of the prior, it indirectly allows you to choose that that C or M in a way that depends on the prior. So we provide like a data-driven way of choosing this M parameter if you want to do that, right? It's might be safer to just pick, a value that's reasonable, but we provide some theory to justify a data-driven way of choosing it.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, then yeah. Let's thank our speaker. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us today. And well, we'll see you next week.
All right, thanks a lot.
Bye, everyone.
great seeing everyone, or seeing some of you at least, and you seeing me. So thanks again for the invitation, and hope I can come out there to see you in person sometime.
We
Thanks
hope
again.
to. Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Jeff. Bye.